Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Joseph Ryder Anderson podcast number 3. Today is going to be a little bit of a blast from the past for some of you, as we're going to be looking at the Bleach Purple build yet again. I say yet again because I've written about this somewhat extensively on the website, but this is our first podcast episode talking about one of my favorite decks and also one of the top decks still in the Union Arena meta. Bleach Purple is known for having powerful sidelining and removal effects that you can activate, usually based on how many cards you have in your own sideline. So it's a deck that in some ways gets stronger the more hits you take, the more cards you use, the more you're able to use to fuel your sideline with your own effects, is the stronger this deck gets. Now, unlike the more typical Bleach build that I have written about in the past and that many others have also talked about, I'm going to be talking about a unique take on the Ichigo Byakuya build. So while this is not in itself a new concept, plenty of people have had success combining these two characters. This deck does it in its own way, and it's a pretty effective deck. That I also used this deck recently to top a tournament, and well, that wasn't a huge tournament. I'm going to use some of those matchups as well as some other matchups that I've faced to help you get an idea of why this deck is the way it is and what to do in certain situations. To start out with, though, we're going to be diving into each one of the cards in this deck, and we're going to be looking at why those cards are included and how you use them in battle. So to start things off, to get a full idea of what this deck looks like, check out the link in the comments in the notes section, or if you're on the website, you'll see it on the page, the podcast page. I'll be sharing the actual image for this deck there. But to start out with, we do run 4 0-cost Uryu Ishida. So Uryu is a very necessary card for this deck, and he's so necessary that you also are going to pair him with the Orihime for the 1-cost Orihime that generates 2 energy, but you have to bounce a card back when you play her. The reason why you're always going to pair these is that you really want to be playing Uryu and bouncing Uryu. He's your main character you want to bounce. You can bounce the 1-cost Ichigo, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but you don't want to be attacking with Uryu early on. You want to be using him to draw cards and sideline cards. He is your main draw engine in this deck. Bleach Purple doesn't have a ton of other draw. It does have a few event cards you can use. This list doesn't. It does also have the Raid Rukia, but Raid Rukia doesn't have a great raid target. She has a 3-cost raid target, which makes her a little less easy to get off. And also, honestly, you have so many great raid characters in this deck that she feels a little bit underwhelming compared to those. So Uryu is your main draw engine. So what that means is, if you like to play aggressively, which I do, you really don't want to play Uryu going first. You don't want to play Uryu as your first character. That's one thing I've learned from playing a lot of Bleach Purple, is you want to open with any of your other 0-costs if you can. Obviously, if Uryu is your only 0-cost character, you're going to play him because you really want to get something on the board. But if you have anybody else in your hand, run with somebody else. And how you pick who you start with, if you have multiple options, let's say if you have all of your 0-cost characters, go with the character who you're least likely to need as a raid target right away. So, for example, if you have a Byakuya 5-cost raid in hand, maybe don't play your Byakuya first, play your Ichigo first, because you can probably lose a 0-cost Ichigo, etc., etc. Now, what you're going to do then instead is you're going to look to play Uryu either going second or on your second turn. If you go first, you're going to want to put down one of your other 0-costs. The second turn, promote them, and ideally, you're then playing the Uryu and bouncing the Uryu on the second turn. So that's how you get that early push, along with establishing your energy line, along with also bouncing the Uryu. You want to always be looking to bounce the Uryu if possible. Again, I don't know if we talked about this already, but Uryu has the when played draw card, sideliner card. That's kind of fundamental to how he works. There's a lot of other characters in the game that have this effect, but most decks don't care with how many cards you have in the sideline, so this effect isn't as powerful in all decks as it is in this one. Moving on to Renji Abarai. So the deck that I was testing with that ended up winning me the tournament that I played in is the zero cost Renji Abarai. He's got 2000 BP and he's got the powerful active trigger. And anybody who's played Union Arena knows that the active trigger can actually win you games. It boosts your BP substantially, allowing you to take hits from almost any character and live to tell the tale. I only run 2 of him because Renji Abarai actually is a character who you're not probably going to be looking to raid all that often because he's pretty effective played raidless. He's got the active damage too, so if you pay an AP, you can give him damage too, which is useful in a lot of situations. He also does have a removal effect when played. However, you have so many other removal effects in this deck that are using up cards in your sideline. Basically, Bleach Purple works by taking cards from your sideline and putting them in the removal area. The number depends on the effect and the character you're using. But Renji Abarai has a relatively... He only reduces BP by 3,000, which isn't horrible, but it costs 4 cards from your sideline to do that. So it's just not always the most economic choice. You have other characters that need those cards in the sideline, like your 5-cost Ichigo, to do a lot of damage. However, it can still be helpful in some scenarios. So he's versatile enough to include a couple of Renji raid targets, but you don't have to raid him all the time, which means you don't have to run a million of all 4 Renjis if you don't want to, or even other Renji options. So in this deck, that's the reasoning behind having 2. There are 4 Byakuyas 0 cost and 4 Ichigo 0 costs, and that's because those 2 make for solid raid targets. We've already talked about the Orihime. When possible, you want to use the Orihime to bounce an Uryu. Typically, you're probably not going to want more than 1 Orihime on your board, on your field, but it's not awful if you do. You can use her. You can play 2 Orihimes and have a 4, just basically a dedicated 4 energy line, for energy generation energy line. There are some problems with that later on. It might be kind of a bummer because it really is not fun to promote Orihime unless if you're going for like a kill move, but usually you can get away with just having 1 Orihime and you're good to go. And actually, if you get an Orihime on your energy line, typically that's all you need to really get things rolling, because you're going to have in this deck plenty of 3-cost characters with 2 energy generation to build up to your bigger characters. Before that, however, this deck is running 2 copies of the 1-cost Ichigo character. When played, you get to look at the top card of your deck, sideline it, or put it at the bottom of your deck. This is a very strong card in general. It's versatile. It has the color trigger, so if it gets hit off of life, you get to bring back 1 character and put on your front line active with 2 energy costs or less. So it has that powerful purple color trigger, which is one of the strongest in the game. I would put it at probably number 2, second strongest in the game. And it can be bounced with Orihime, so you can reuse that when played, look at the top card over and over if you need to. And it's a great way to fuel your sideline. I would actually love to run 4 of these Ichigos. He's that good, and the only reason I only run 2 is because I really wanted to in this list, and I think it was a good choice, include the 3-cost Byakuya, who also has the color trigger. If you're not running that 3-cost Byakuya, definitely consider running 4 of these 1-cost Ichigos because he's that good. He's another thing, if I had mentioned, he can be a great raid target on top of his effect, on top of his color trigger. He can also be a great pusher, so you can promote him to the front line and use him to take some early game life. He's got 2500 BP, which puts him in like killing range for most other targets you're going to be facing. He's just a very solid card all around. Moving on to the next card on this list, since we don't run any 2 costs, we're going straight into the Ichigo Kurosaki. So a lot of people who play Bleach Purple run the Kisuke 2-cost Kisuke that generates any energy when active. I have had lots of success playing decks that have him. However, in general, as time has gone by playing Union Arena, I have tended to stay away from those characters, right? This character is available to virtually every in color, and it's a card that is good in very specific situations, just not good in others. Basically, the only time you would actually want to play a card like that is if it is your second turn and you have second turn and you have 2 energy on board. That's the only time it's really effective to play him, because otherwise you were pretty much hoping that you could just build up to 3 energy and play your 3-cost character who has just 2 energy built in, and then play more cards that turn. It's more of an effective use of your turn if you can just play the 3-cost with 2 energy gen instead of hoping to get that 2 costs on the second turn. So I'm not sure if that made any sense because it's a bit convoluted, but I just don't really like those characters that gain energy gen when standing, basically is the sum of that story. Now, moving on, we have the powerful 3-cost Ichigo Kurosaki, who has 2 energy generation and 3000 BP, but his most effective effect is that when attacking, he gains 1000 BP. So he basically acts as a 4K attacker. That is huge. That means you can sit on your energy line, you can use him to pump out other powerful characters. You can use him as a raid target too. You remember this deck is going to run, we're going to get into that bit, this deck runs 8 copies of Ichigo Kurosaki raids. So you want a bunch of raid targets for that. So he can be a raid target. He's just an all-around solid card. We already talked a little bit about Byakuya Kuchiki. We have the 3-cost Byakuya, generates 2 energy. Very solid card as well. It's got the color trigger. So again, you get to play a character from your sideline when he's hit off a life. And he's also got a good when played effect. He subtracts the 500 BP from one character on the field. While that might not sound like a ton in this deck, that can be super helpful. That can put certain characters within range of your Byakuya's when played effect, which we'll get into in a little bit. It can also mean taking 1 less card out of your sideline when you play Ichigo, and 5-cost Ichigo and his removal effect, basically. Which, that might not sound like a lot, 1 card, but a lot of times you can win or lose a battle by having the difference of 1 card in your sideline. So, solid card. You're probably not going to use his when played all the time, but sometimes it's very effective, so you want to keep that in mind whenever you have him in your hand and you're going to play him. The next one is Renji Abarai. We have 4 Renji Abarai. We already talked about Renji a bit. Just a really solid card. Typically, you're going to play Renji raidless. He's the card in your deck, the bigger 4000 BP character in your deck that does fine played raidless. And he's essentially here to be played raidless for the most part, and with the option of raiding on occasion. The reason I chose to go less hard into the Renji, partly with the raid too, is that there's just so much consistency in this deck already around the Ichigo and Byakuya that I just didn't want to muddy things up with trying to focus too much on the Renji. Again, we also aren't running the Rukia raid, and for me that's partly because Rukia does work well in decks that like to play raidless. So there's that whole raidless bleach build. If you I think people call it Renji Rush. That's sort of a very popular way of playing Bleach Purple, and it's a very solid way of playing it, I might add. But it does sacrifice a bit by focusing on going raidless, right? And just rushing your opponent. This deck is looking for a lot more higher end power, especially late game with Byakuya. So you're not really looking to just play raidless, you're looking to raid whenever possible. So getting back to Rukia, she's a strong character. Again, another character I've won a lot of tournaments with and done well with. But it just feels like with her, it's very hit or miss whether or not you're going to be able to raid with her. And if you don't care about that and you just want a 4000 BP character, then go ahead and include her. But if you really are looking for some consistency around raiding, it's hard to get her to hit her target when you want to. Her only target is the 3-cost Rukia, and she's not a terribly good 3-cost Rukia. She's not like the Byakuya or Ichigo that generates 2 energy. She only generates 1 energy, and she's kind of like a lower powered attacker. And I've just found that I rarely actually have her on the field, or maybe not rarely, but not as often as I'd like, to get the raid effect, which is really strong. So basically Rukia raid has the when played you draw 3 cards in sideline 2, so that's great to see more cards and to also fuel your sideline. But it just feels like with this version of the deck, there's so many other powerful characters I'd rather focus on, and cards that add more consistency, right? Especially moving on now into the Ichigo, 4-cost Ichigo. This card is actually probably the least strong of all your raid characters in this deck, but he's Ichigo, so he's got tons of consistency. You run a bunch of raid targets, so you could hit this Ichigo off of your life pretty easily, right? And be able to raid with him off of your life, saving you an AP for the next turn. That's one of the most effective use cases for him, because he's only 4 energy. The odds of that happening are pretty good. Like, it's not super hard to have 4 energy on your energy line. He can be a decent closer. I think Byakuya is probably your better one. But Ichigo does gain impact if you remove 4 cards from your sideline, as long as he's been rated. And he does also let you draw cards. So he's kind of incremental draw as well as impact. However, I will say using him as just a draw engine is not the best idea, because 4 cards is a lot of cards in this deck to remove from your sideline. Now moving on to the 5-cost Ichigo, who really is, despite having Byakuya in this deck, Ichigo Kurosaki, the 5-cost, is still your heaviest hitter, because when he's played, you can use him to virtually sideline anything as long as you have the proper amount of cards in your sideline to do so. So he's a very strong character, and other than that, once he's played, he's just a 4K body, right? However, his when played effect is so strong, I really hate to play him raidless. You can totally do that if you need to, but I really hate to do it myself. I'd much rather play the 4-cost Ichigo raidless. And then moving on to now, Ichigo, 5-cost Ichigo is pretty straightforward. You play, he's kind of like a bomb. You just play him, he goes off, you remove a character, move on. Byakuya is a lot different. He's much more of a death by 1,000 cuts kind of character is how I describe it. He's a much more strategic character. Even if you just look at his card, the 5-cost raid Ichigo card, there's a ton of text on that card. People don't even want to read that card because there's so much text. It takes a bit of playing him to figure out how to use him effectively. But we're going to talk about it. It's important to the strategy. When played, you remove 2 cards from your sideline, and you minus your opponent's entire front line by 1,000 BP. That alone is a very strong effect, right? That's kind of like the Gawain from a more recent deck, like Kogias Purple has that effect. And it's a very strong effect in and of itself. And I think that alone is a good reason to play Byakuya. However, that's not all. Once per turn, you can also remove 3 cards from your sideline to give Byakuya impact. So you're not really probably going to want to use impact all the time, but that gives you some late game finishing potential if you need it. Just punch through a last couple holes after you played aggressively and gotten your opponent down, use Byakuya to close that out with impact. That's typically how I use that ability. Otherwise, I'm happy just taking a removal. If someone wants to block him, sure, I'll take that removal as opposed to the impact. And last but not least, when attacking, remove 1 card from your sideline, and you can minus the BP of a character by 1,000. That's interesting to juxtapose that with the 5-cost Ichigo, because again, Ichigo is 1 card equals 500 BP reduction. So actually this effect is stronger in a way than Ichigo, because only 1 card equals 1,000 BP minus. So you can easily, if you play Byakuya on his own, you are already lowering the opposing field by 1,000. Then you can attack and lower by another 1,000, which means you could actually pretty easily remove a lower cost character, a lower BP character, lower energy cost character as well, from the field. That's like almost a free removal right there, assuming your opponent has something low on the field. But where it gets even more interesting is if you combine this with Senbon Sakurai Kageyoshi. I have 2 of these in the deck. Getsuga Tensho is the other special. I have 2 of those. It's a very strong special, and you really do need it, especially if you're facing off against 5Ks, so you should have some Getsuga. But Senbon Sakurai has the potential to take multiple removals in a turn if you combine it with Byakuya well. And the easiest way to do this is, let's say your opponent has a 4K character. This happened in a recent matchup where my opponent had a 4K Yuji on the board and then a 1,500 character on the board. So what you do is you play the Senbon Sakurai, you minus the 4K character by 3,000 BP, you minus the other character by 1,000, and then you drop the Byakuya, you play his when played effect, and you have just taken out 2 characters from a single play. So very strong. There's other ways that you can use this. You can combine it with Ichigo's when played. You can do a lot of different things. You can combine it with Renji's when played. There's a lot of things you can do, especially if you're hitting your Bankai. There's a lot of different things you can do to make this effective with Byakuya, and it takes some time to master that. But I think the most straightforward one that you need to know is how to combine him with Senbon Sakurai to take basically two removals in a turn. I think, too, one thing you might look at the Senbon Sakurai if you're not familiar with it, and it says Action 2. However, it becomes Action 1 in your hand when Byakuya is on the field, any old Byakuya. So that's important to keep in mind. So, now that we've gone over every single card in the deck, we're going to talk about a couple of matchups. So I think let's first talk about the matchups I faced from the most recent tournament I played using this deck. And one of them is Lancelot. So Lancelot is a top deck. It's not the best deck, but it's in the top like 5 or so right now. And that's Lancelot is from the Code Geass set, and he's a green deck. So with this deck, has the potential to be a bad matchup. However, I wouldn't necessarily say it's a bad matchup, especially since you have Byakuya. And that's another reason why this Byakuya build works. Actually, in the early days, people were teching in Byakuya into the Bleach Purple build, partly just to deal with 5,000 BP characters. So Lancelot does have some 5,000 BP characters. However, a lot of people, I will say, are these days playing Lancelot raidless. So a lot of people are just building up the 6 energy line and then just dropping as many Lancelots in a turn as they can. And in the case that he's raidless, Lancelot only actually has 4,000 BP. But in the case that someone does raid him, which happens, you can easily use your Byakuya when played to lower that 1,000 BP if you need to, and then you're able to cut through him with your attacks. That's the main con of facing down a 5,000 BP deck for Bleach Purple, and a lot of other decks like Bleach Purple that only have 4,000 BP characters. It's harder to swing through those 5,000 BP attack defenders. So again, Byakuya pretty much neutralizes that, because when you play him, you can lower that you're opposing the whole opposing front line by 1,000 BP. The main thing with Lancelot, again, in this tournament, I faced 2 different Lancelot decks, and the main thing is just to really focus those early plays to get as many attackers on the front line as possible. And the way you do that is just by hitting your curve. I think that thing I told you about playing somebody other than Uryu, so then you can bounce to Uryu, so you can just keep your curve, your energy line full, keep your curve going while still ensuring you're getting those early game attacks. If you have a raid character, you don't hold this. Lancelot is not a deck that you hold it back against. You just play that raid character, you get those characters out there, you get those attacks, you take that life. You just want to avoid a situation where they are just filling their board with big characters off of a really big energy line. So that's how you win. You just go aggro basically against Lancelot, and you have the power to back that up. It's not like you're going to just run out of steam, because in the worst case scenario, you can still remove those Lancelots if you need to. So Lancelot's not a huge issue for this deck. You just have to make sure you know what you're doing. The next win was against a blue JJK deck. And actually, the interesting thing was I had played at a tournament the night before against some blue JJK decks. 2 different ones. But they were both Sukuna decks. And this was also a Sukuna focused deck, not the Nanami build. And the thing I found about that deck is that there's just so much removal in blue Sukuna. And they have, like, especially that 2 AP cost Itadori card that they can just play and bounce some lower characters with. And that was partly what inspired me to add a bit more power to my Bleach Purple build. I'd been playing my more standard list, which was with the Rukiyas without the Byakuyas. And I just felt like in the current meta, there's room to play Ichigo, or to play Bleach Purple as a more higher end deck, right? Not just focusing the raidless rush thing, but really playing it as a powerhouse 5 energy deck, And I think doing so actually does help in the matchup against blue JJK, because otherwise you're sort of just going toe to toe with it. You're both trying to remove, but I think that where you lose out in the matchup is that they have some late game closing that Bleach Purple typically doesn't. However, having Byakuya in the mix does give you a lot more power. So in this matchup, I went up against, I already mentioned, the move that sealed it for me really is they hit a special off of my life. And after that, I then used the Senbon Sakurai Byakuya combo to clear 2 characters from the board. And after that, they just didn't really have a response for that. Obviously, I was keeping the tempo, attacking, taking life, being aggressive, all the things that you need to do against blue JJK. But that Senbon Sakurai really did kind of seal the deal there, getting rid of both those characters, taking extra life in a turn. So I think that play, if you can get all the things you need to get both a Byakuya and a Senbon Sakurai off in a single turn, you're going to be much better off. Lastly, against the Hashira deck, honestly, Hashira is not an issue for this deck. I didn't feel at all during that battle like I was behind. I think the main thing is just again, you got to be aggressive. You got to watch out for those higher end BP characters like the Stone Hashira that has the 4500 BP. Things like that. There's some little tricks you have to watch out for. You have to like watch out for like the double attackers. But if you're just paying attention to those sort of nuances that Hashira has, then it's not a bad matchup at all, I would say. I would say you have better removal. You have the raid characters. Hashira doesn't really have. Has like one character that can come in active. But you have the better removal and the better aggression. So Hashira should not really be an issue for you. So those are the matchups that I faced in that tournament. I'm trying to think of any other. I think the other one to talk about, this was not in that particular tournament, but I've certainly faced it in the past with Bleach Purple, is Code Geass Purple. And it's a pretty even matchup, but I will say that Bleach Purple can do more on the lower end than Code Geass. Code Geass is pretty dependent on hitting that 5 energy line. Whereas this deck, the way I build it, because it's focused on Byakuya, does also have benefits a lot from hitting that 5 cost on the energy line, 5 energy gen on the energy line, sorry. But it's not as dependent. So you can like play your Renji raids raidless. You can play your Ichigos raidless. You can just build up to 4 and do some raids with those two guys. You can also remove a lot of smaller characters pretty easily with Senbon Sakurai and Byakuya. So you have a lot of the same tools that they have, but you can do it a little bit on the lower end, which I think gives Bleach Purple a slight edge over Code Geass. It also has less trouble with a full board of powerful characters because of just how much removal you have, whereas Code Geass can get a little overwhelmed if they face down a full board of big characters. So yeah, I would give the slight edge to Bleach Purple in the Code Geass matchup. Really the only matchup I've noticed that's a bad matchup is there's 2. One is Kurapika tends to be a tougher matchup for Bleach. And I think that's why Kurapika was dominating the meta early on, is that its main rival is Bleach Purple, but Kurapika would often beat it. And then I think Blue JJK is a troublesome matchup. I think it's the worst one is not the one that I mentioned from the tournament, but the worst one is actually the Nanami build, because the Sukuna Nanami build plays the ratio technique special, which sends your character to the bottom of the deck, which is really painful for Bleach Purple because you're getting way less characters into your sideline. So not only are you getting hit with the Itadori raid and those characters are going back to your hand, you're then getting characters sent to the bottom of the deck. So you end up with a lot less cards in your sideline. I think too, this deck doesn't play a lot of tons of cards to focus the sideline. Getting cards to the sideline, you really are leaning heavily on Uryu, and that just makes it all the more important to ensure that you're always bouncing and recycling Uryu when it makes sense to do so. So those are the other big matchups to watch out for. And yeah, that's it. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next time.